Welcome to episode 309 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Melanie Trecek-King about how to identify and combat misinformation and how to teach information literacy skills to students. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. This episode is brought to you in part by a really important podcast that I hope you'll check out. It's called Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. It's hosted by Julian Saavedra, an assistant principal in Philadelphia who has spent nearly 20 years working in public schools. You'll hear Julian talk with parents and experts to help offer tools that will allow you to support your students better. You can even share this free podcast with kids' families, as it's a wonderful resource for parents as well. To listen to Opportunity Gap, just search for Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently in your podcast app. That's Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. The topic of today's podcast episode is information literacy and critical thinking. Check out my new curriculum line for middle and high school students called Finding Flow Solutions. Each lesson includes a student journal and a slideshow that are no prep for the teacher and rigorous for kids, helping them learn metacognition skills so they can think about their own thinking. Go to findingflowsolutions.com to learn more. That's findingflowsolutions.com. I'm talking today with Melanie Trecek-King, an assistant professor of biology in Massachusetts. She teaches a general education science course designed to equip college students with critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy skills. She's an active speaker and consultant and loves to share her approach of teach skills, not facts, with other educators. Listen in as Melanie and I discuss what you need to know about misinformation and how to teach your students critical thinking and information literacy skills. So, Melanie, one of the things that I really loved about your approach is how compassionate and empathetic you are, and your insistence that we all fall for misinformation. It's just a matter of what kind of misinformation we're most susceptible to. So it doesn't mean that a person is stupid if they believe in a conspiracy theory or other types of disinformation. And I think this is a really important place to begin because it really humanizes the other side. So they are no longer idiots or horrible people. They're just folks who have beliefs and things that they don't realize aren't true. Can you say more about that?
We are all prone to falling for various types of misinformation. To me, whenever I talk about misinformation with students or people, everybody seems to understand misinformation as a problem, but we all think it's somebody else's problem. Like, we're too smart to fall for misinformation. But of course, we know other people who have fallen for it. And the problem with that is we can't all fall for it. But also, there's not necessarily a link between intelligence and what you fall for. Right? We all have blind spots. We all have things that we want to believe or don't want to believe. And so part of not falling for misinformation means recognizing your own vulnerabilities.
You've identified 3 primary reasons that we fall for misinformation: confirmation bias, appeals to emotion, and the reiteration effect. I'd like to unpack each one of those with you one by one. Let's start with confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias is our tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm what we already think is true. And so once we think something is true, we see evidence for it everywhere. And every time we do, it reconfirms that belief. And the problem is, skepticism is the single most important factor to protect yourself from misinformation. But the most important time to be skeptical and the hardest time to be skeptical is when something confirms our biases. Because if I'm scrolling through a news feed and I see something that fits with how I think the world works, then why would I question it? I mean, it makes sense. And so it just seeps in there and I accept it as true. So, funny story here. My husband and I like to play card games, and I don't like to lose. And so, so we have this game that we play, and we've played it a lot. And every time we pull out the game, I'm like, "Oh gosh, you're going to beat me again, aren't you? Here we go." And he's like, "What are you talking about? You win all the time." No, I don't. You beat me all the time. Now, the interesting part here is that he's been keeping score. So he knows exactly how many games he's won and how many I've won. And I think right now we're like 90 something to 60 something. So, I mean, I do win more than he does. But if he didn't have that data, I wouldn't, I would still think that I lost more because that matters to me more. And when I lose, it confirms that bias. And when he wins, I think, oh, this is, if I win, oh, this is just a now thing. But, I lose more often than all of that is a way just continue to interpret information in in a way that confirms how we see the world. This is even why we fall for satire. So, like, satire makes us laugh by making a point, but we've all seen people who've fallen for satire, and it's because it fits with, of course, that's the way that it works. And so they don't question it.
How can we be skeptical in those moments when we first encounter information? What would that look like to be skeptical about something that is confirming our existing worldview?
Yeah, this is where it's the hardest time to be skeptical, because you can't be skeptical about everything all the time.
Right.
It would just take way too much energy. So to me, it's more about knowing your own vulnerabilities, and about having that healthy level of just awareness to allow the question to enter your mind. Because if you don't stop and question whether something is true, then you won't check. And so I teach my students how to fact check, but you won't fact check if you already just think something is true. So that little check in your head, just check in with yourself. Is this true? Another story here. So last year at Halloween, this image was going around, and it was Halloweeners, the like black licorice flavored hot dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw people sharing this that honestly, I would have thought should known better. They were PhDs and academics and nutritionists and people who fight misinformation. And they're like, look at Americans' diet. This is absolutely disgusting. And I thought, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. So I fact checked it. And in fact, it was an altered image. It was satire. And they fell for it because it confirmed, Americans' diets are terrible. So of course Americans would eat black licorice flavored hot dogs.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So this is just about being aware of your confirmation bias and, maybe not going into everything with skepticism, because as you mentioned, that really it's a drain on our resources. Our brain, uses confirmation bias to help us think more efficiently. If we question everything we learn, that's just not efficient. So, it's something that's set up to help us, but can we get more curious about it? What else might be true? What might be another perspective? And that sort of thing. Is that the kind of direction you're going with the confirmation bias?
You're right. We literally can't be skeptical about everything. And so knowing the times and places, and so sometimes, there's more at stake if you're not skeptical. Especially if you're going to share something or like it or interact with it in some way, then check.
Right. Another reason that we fall for misinformation, in addition to confirmation bias, is appeals to emotion. How does that work?
So this is a broad group of fallacies that include any number of emotions, but in particular, anger and outrage and fear trigger the part of our brain that is highly emotional, the fight, flight, freeze part. And when it does that, we're less able to think critically. A lot of forms of misinformation specifically appeal to our emotions to try and convince us without evidence. And so they'll use hyperbolic language or overly sensationalized name calling, yelling. And so if you feel yourself being emotionally triggered, it's a pretty good sign that you might want to slow down and practice some emotional skepticism. It's also why we fall for satire again, because satire confirms our biases, or it can, but it also makes us laugh. And so there's another emotion where, once we've got that emotional part of the brain going, then our critical thinking faculties are less online.
So we may fall for misinformation due to confirmation bias or appeals to emotion. Another reason is the reiteration effect. Let's talk about that one.
Yeah, so its other name is illusory truth effect. I like reiteration effect because it describes more what the concept is. Basically, the more we hear something repeated, the more likely we are to think it's true, even if it's not true. And actually, in studies, if you tell people this is not true, but you give them the piece of misinformation and then tell it to them again and again, they're going to remember it as true. So, this is really a problem if you're in an echo chamber where the same false information is pinging around and around and around. Our brain assumes ease of processing with truth. So we hear it again and again. Every time we hear it, our brain doesn't have to think about it quite as much. And so over time, the brain just equates that with, well, it must be true.
I definitely feel like I see that a lot in politics, where there's certain talking points or certain party lines, and folks will repeat it over and over and again. And I realize I've heard this so many times, and I don't actually think this is true. I don't think there's any data to back this up at all. I think this is their own spin. But literally, it's become like such a talking point. I've heard it repeatedly. And I think it definitely, I've seen that in myself. It's made me believe that something like that was true, even though I knew that it was actually just a talking point, just based on the amount of times that I heard it spoken and the amount of times that I saw it in print.
Yeah, and isn't it hard to? I commend you for doing that because once you've heard it so many times, it is even hard to step back and question if it's true.
You have a really amazing article on your site called The Problem with Doing Your Own Research. And I loved that because I feel like that's become like such the buzzword of the last few years, like do your own research. What's the problem with that?
Yeah, the problem is this is a broad generalization here, but oftentimes when this is being used, what this means is I went to Google and I looked for information that confirmed what I already thought was true. And that is not how research works. So there is a difference between primary and secondary research, and one can do research by looking at existing research. But it is still a systematic way of collecting and evaluating evidence. And when someone is doing their own research, if it's not in an area that they have expertise in, so there's a limited knowledge, they don't know what they're looking for, they don't know the body of evidence, there's there's a giant hole of a lack of understanding, but a desire to fill it. And it's usually with something that we want to believe or don't want to believe. And so that motivation fuels us. We go to a search engine and we use it we even find a study that says, and you can find a study that says anything. And so I could even go to Google Scholar and I could type in something and go see science. But to me, this highlights the importance of knowing what you don't know. And recognizing your limits. And ironically, I often see this from people who fashion themselves as some sort of independent thinker. And this phrase really bothers me a bit because none of us are independent thinkers. And even if we can think critically and deeply about a particular topic, it is impossible to do on every topic. None of us can have that kind of knowledge. And the result is you're ultimately going to have to trust someone else. So if I'm not doing primary research, if I'm doing secondary research and I'm looking at other existing sources, who do I choose to trust and why? And oftentimes when our biases are leading us, we're picking the sources that tell us what we want to hear and not necessarily the ones that are most reliable.
Yeah, we're not doing our own research. We're doing our own Googling. Number one, that's a big part of it. Another thing that comes to mind when I think about people doing their own research and our confirmation bias is that the lack of trust in our society is a big problem. And it seems like because you can find an article that confirms pretty much anything, you can find a study that has been interpreted in any kind of way. It might be a study with 8 participants, but these scientists have reached a conclusion that X, Y, and Z is true. And so we have a situation right now, specifically in the US, in which we do not trust our experts. We don't trust our teachers to make good decisions for kids. We don't trust our public schools. We don't trust our doctors. We don't trust our politicians. There's just such a lack of trust. And I think we have to be really careful in not abandoning the idea that truth exists. Truth can be uncovered and we can understand it. And that there are people who benefit from us giving up and just saying, well, I guess we'll never really know. There's a lot of things that we can know. And I think we can approach it with intellectual humility, as you're saying, knowing what we don't know, and always being open to more information. But it's so important that, we cannot be independent thinkers on everything. That shouldn't even be the goal necessarily, I don't think, because independent thinker means that I don't trust anybody else who has dedicated their life's work to studying this, understanding this, is credentialed in it, is living and breathing this thing. And I think it's especially important for teachers to consider, because we in education know what that's like to not be trusted. We know what it's like for some stranger on the internet to think they know better than we do about what we should be doing in our classrooms. So I'm always trying to be mindful of not necessarily deferring to people who have more expertise, but certainly listening to them and considering them. Because if you have expertise and skills and experience in an area that I don't, your opinion should weigh a little bit higher in my mind than just, Joe Schmo on Facebook who was leaving a comment about something that he found in doing his own research.
I am so glad you brought that up because, there's a lot of talk about post-truth, and I don't think we're in a post-truth, actually. I think people want the truth. I do think that some have so much cynicism at this point that they doubt the ability to find a truth.
Yes.
But I think you're right. That is actually a function of the lack of trust. And sometimes that's not by accident. So the post-truth, I think it's more of a post-trust. Instead of trusting the most reliable sources of information or the most reliable processes of information, of knowledge production, we're trusting, air quotes, those in our tribes or in our groups that tell us, confirm our identities or share similar beliefs. Disinformation pushes distrust partly for that reason. So misinformation is information that's not true. Disinformation is deliberately deceitful. So disinformation is a subcategory of misinformation. Disinformation purveyors have a strategy of sowing doubt. So they don't have to prove to you that the consensus is wrong. They just have to sow enough doubt that gets you to go, well, I don't know. We don't know enough, so maybe we shouldn't do anything. And then they, by definition, have to appeal to conspiracy theories, because that is really the only way to explain why basically all the world's experts don't hold that position. So they're all conspiring. And of course, you can't trust any of them. They're out to get you. We're on your side, right? And that opens the door then for whatever it is that they want to sell you. So that breakdown of trust is part of a strategy. It's sometimes a side product of other things, but disinformation purposefully sows distrust for that reason. I just wanted to, I circled back because you also said, I wrote it down, independent thinker means that I don't trust others' expertise. And that's totally what that means. It's I trust myself and not experts. And I will say, for myself at least, I know what I know within a relatively narrow area, and I know there's more to know within that area, and I know there's a whole lot more that I don't know. But importantly, I know where to go to find that information. I don't have to know everything. I just need to know who knows it so that I can have the best access to that information. And that's why human societies are so successful, in part is because we specialize. We break down and I can study critical thinking, and somebody else grows my food, and somebody else treats my wastewater and fixes my car and flies my plane. That's how societies are built. And that trust breakdown is a serious problem.
It is. And understanding that that is an intentional strategy, by people who have ulterior motives there. I often hear it phrases like, I'm just asking questions, just asking questions. And that's, sort of code for, I'm just going to sow some seeds of doubt and poke at this a little bit, but I don't actually have any answers. I don't have any research. I don't have any expertise. I'm just going to kind of make you distrust other sources besides me. And to just recognize that as a strategy. The goal is to get people to give up on ever discerning truth, to think that it's just not possible to arrive at it. And that's a way to, as you mentioned, it's a way to control. It's a way to keep you within that bubble of information, and trust them and not anyone else.
Ironically, the way that it's often packaged is a false sense of empowerment, meaning people who have fallen for this think that they know better, that they are armed with knowledge and have even special knowledge, and they know that they can't trust. It feels enlightened, but it is the opposite of that. But that feeling, the feeling of certainty, the feeling of knowing, that feeling of empowerment is incredibly difficult to break through. That level of certainty, of confidence, is really hard to break down.
Right. And we've got those three reasons that we fall for misinformation at play. We've got confirmation bias. This person is questioning an expert that I don't like, or questioning someone who sees the world differently than me. It's appealing to my emotion. It's making me feel empowered. It's also making me feel angry because I'm being lied to. And it's the reiteration effect. You're continually, telling me that this can't be trusted or this isn't right. And then those three things together, starts to make sense. Maybe that conspiracy is true.
Yeah.
So let's get into how to teach these skills to students. You have tons of really clever and engaging free lessons on your site. And what my favorite is Wake Up Sheeple, which I feel like ties into what we're talking about here so perfectly. It's a design your own conspiracy lesson. And it's designed to show kids how conspiracy theories originate and how easily they spread. So I'm going to link in the show notes, and in the article for this episode, I'm going to link to that. I'm going to link to your lesson on how to inoculate against information, and something you have called Floater, a toolkit against misinformation. So those are some of the gems that I found on your site. But tell me some of your favorite ways to make these kinds of topics that we've talked about accessible to kids and to make information literacy meaningful for them.
So I love this question, and you're probably going to have to shut me up at some point.
Good. Let's camp out on this. Let's do it.
So one of the things that I've discovered in teaching these skills is that it's the most important first step is to get students to recognize that they can be fooled. And so I start class by I fool them day one. I tell them that I have a friend who is an astrologer, and she's going to do free personality readings on them. And so I give them a few questions, and I say, next time I'll give you readings. The next time okay, we're going to vote. So silently read this. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how accurate is she? So 1 to 5, I've been doing this for years, about 4.3 to 4.5 out of 5. She's super accurate. The students are really excited. Okay, now talk to the person next to you about what you thought was accurate and why. And sometimes it can take them 10 to 15 minutes before they realize they all got the same reading. Now, I didn't come up with this. This was originally done by Bertram Forer in the 50s. James Randi made it famous. It's based on Barnum statements, things like you have a need for people to like and admire you. You've wondered whether you've done or said the right things. You've questioned your life choices. Pretty statements basically apply to all of us. But I do this because I want students to realize that they can be fooled. Now, if you don't want to be fooled, that's what critical thinking is for. But if I told them they could be fooled, they'd be like, sure, professor, I'm smarter than that. But no, you can be fooled. So I do it to prove that to them. And then we start to talk about how we come to our beliefs. And so I start with what I call the critical thinking training wheels approach. I'm purposefully starting with beliefs that aren't triggering because I want students to think about the process, get used to how it feels in the brain to evaluate these beliefs and the evidence for them. without being emotionally triggered. And so I cover the witchcraft trials in Europe from like the 15th to the 17th centuries. And we talk about the things people were accused of and the things people confessed to. Okay, why did they confess? Well, let me show you. And so I show them some of the torture, and it's horrible, right? Now, I would confess to basically anything. And a lot of people did. Okay, was that good evidence? They were obviously convinced they were right. I mean, they were so convinced they were torturing and killing hundreds of thousands of people. But was their evidence good? Now, I want them to turn that in on themselves. But from this bird's eye view, where they're not personally vested in this belief, they can look at them and go, well, they thought they were right. How good was their evidence? Right? So I'm moving as we go through this like basic epistemology and metacognition, and then I include a lot of misinformation in class. I think this is really key because if we don't show students what bad science looks like, science denial, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, or fake news, or whatever it is, if we don't show students that and only show them the good stuff, that's not how the real world works. They're going to walk out of our classrooms, get on their phones, and then how can they tell the difference? So seeing the misinformation helps them understand the characteristics of the more reliable information. The toolkit is really helpful because I realized I was asking students to evaluate claims, but like, where do you start? You know, I'll give them Reiki or crystal healing. Okay, well, think critically through this. Oh, it's a mountain, right? Where do you start? So the toolkit is intended to break down, like start at the beginning. Can I test this claim? So the F is falsifiability. Can I prove it wrong? Is it logical? What kinds of fallacies are being committed here? Am I being honest with myself? The objectivity. Are there other ways to explain this? The alternative explanations, tentative conclusions, evidence, reproducibility. All of that is a way to help students think through claims. I start it early in the semester. I give them lots of opportunities to practice, and I dive into different rules in different levels of detail as the semester progresses. And I have them create misinformation. So the critical thing, the conspiracy theory that you're referencing is an example. I teach my students how to cold read like psychics. I teach them how to argue illogically. Actually, this is one of my favorite assignments. I realized, so I teach a course on critical thinking, and the end of the semester, one semester, I was getting, around finals time, I was getting these emails from students saying that they should pass the class, and I was reading them going, if you learned what I was hoping to teach you, you wouldn't be sending me this argument. And so now it's an assignment early on in the semester. I teach them logical fallacies, and I say, okay, pretend it's the end of the semester, and you're failing. Because you deserve to, right? In this scenario, you should not pass. Send me an email arguing for why you should pass the class using at least 4 fallacies from class. And so they'll tell me like, well, my dog got hit by a car and I'm really sad. And if you fail me, I'm going to be living in a tent and be homeless for the rest of my life. Or my parents think I should pass. Or, oh, they love to insult my character. So lots of ad hominem attacks. But the point is, it's always fun, right? These are in jest, humorous assignments. So they send me these emails, and then they have to find the fallacies that other students used in their arguments. So yeah, it's a riot. And then there's one on, I have them create advertisements for fake pseudoscience products. I teach them how to be science deniers. And the whole point is that they can learn to recognize the techniques of that particular type of misinformation so that they don't fall for it in the real world.
Right. Right. If you recognize it, then you understand what's happening. And I find it so interesting, you know, as someone who runs an online business, you know, I'm an entrepreneur. I see the marketing hacks, you know, and the things that marketers do. And, you know, people in my industry see right through it, but the average person has no idea that this whole thing is just a way to get someone on their email list or, you know, whatever the thing is. But the more that you see it, you sort of can't unsee it. And that's really powerful.
That's exactly what my students tend to tell me. After the psychic cold reading, they're like, I'll show them how to do it and then show them psychics and they'll go, wait, what? That's right. And they'll say, I can't unsee this now. And I bring in my lab coats and let students take pictures of themselves in lab coats. And so Dr. So-and-so says it works. Certified by it. Sometimes they'll just put certified on it. No certification body or anything. Technobabble. So like phytochemical enzyme electron vibrations at the cellular level or something like it's science mad libs, but make it sound sciencey. And yeah, the students will all say, "Oh, look at this I saw on Instagram, professor. This is exactly like what we." Yes, it is exactly the same.
What age group do you think it's appropriate to start introducing these concepts with?
Yeah, so I teach college students. I have taught this class to high school students, and aspects of it have been taught to middle school. I would definitely say I think middle school is right for this. Students at that age are curious and able to handle the more challenging concepts. Starting earlier is better.
Yeah. Yeah. My classroom teaching experience was at the elementary level, and this was actually part of what we taught in third grade was recognizing, author's purpose. And even just that alone was a great entryway into talking about this, because you could see, okay, this person is writing to persuade, or, this is advertisement, this is copy. They want me to buy something. How do people describe something different when they're selling it to you? Versus when they're just informing you about something and their purpose was to inform. And I've found that anytime I do any of this kind of critical thinking work with students of any age, because as an instructional coach, I've done it at the middle and high school level, and kids love this. They feel like, finally, you are giving me something real world. This actually helps me, feel smarter. And this is real empowerment versus the fake empowerment we were talking about before, where we're just going to cast doubt on everything, and just, poke holes in other people's theories. No, we're going to recognize that misinformation comes because of the ways that our brains process information. And that's what makes us susceptible to it. So we can be aware of how our brains learn, how our brains process info, what we're susceptible to, and recognize the tactics that are used, and the different forms they come in. And I've found that kids love it. And I'm betting you found the same.
Oh, absolutely. The students absolutely love it. And, there was one other type of assignment or skill that I think is really important to teach students, and that is lateral reading. Are you familiar with this?
Yes.
So I know a lot of teachers still teach the crap test. And the crap test, it must be about 20 years old at this point. It was one of the first ways to teach students how to evaluate what they see online. The problem with evaluating a source like that is that it asks students to stay on a site to determine if it's reliable. And if a site wants to mislead you, they will figure out a way to do so. And so one of the fastest, most effective ways to teach students how to fact check, and you can do this, I've done it in 15 minutes. What I'll do is I'll give them an example and say, is this reliable? And they will all go to the site and they'll look around, and I'll let them waste their time. And they'll usually get it wrong. And then I'll say, okay, now what I want you to do instead is lateral reading. So lateral reading was proposed by Sam Weinberg at Stanford. So instead of going through a site vertically, you open a new tab, search the claim and something like fact check, or search the source and something like reliable, trustworthy, credible, something like that. And then use the power of the information ecosystem to help you determine if the claim or the source are trustworthy. And that will take 20 seconds, and students will instantaneously see it. But then once students are scrolling through their news feeds, ask them, or their social media feeds, that the practice of being skeptical, so you've taught them that, and then you've taught them how to check, right? And once you get those practices down and they become second nature, it's so much easier.
Yeah, that's so valuable to think about, being the skills of being skeptical and the skills of checking. Because we know with a lot of kids, if they don't know something, they won't search on Google, they'll search on TikTok. And then you don't even have the benefit at that point of looking around the website and seeing, how do things look here? What are the references? Like, it's an entirely different way of getting information, but these same skills apply: skeptical, fact checking.
Yeah, something else that I do with my students, because they tend to not know why they're seeing what they're seeing on these various platforms.
Mm.
Um, and so having students pull out, again, appropriate for your classroom, you can all decide, but pull out your favorite social media platforms, put students in groups where they're not with the people who are their close friends. So a bit of diversity. Now scroll through your social media feeds and how are they different?
Mm.
And so students can start to see that their feed looks very different than somebody else's feed. Now amplify that by every day, every week, and so on. And then you're seeing all of this information and how that impacts your worldview, how you see the world, um, and how others might be experiencing the world differently, in part because their online ecosystems are so much different. And actually, one of the projects I'm currently working on is with the Center for Inquiry's Generation Skeptics. And we're using some of the videos, the short videos that I've created for social media. They're on my YouTube channel for bell ringers, for educators
Mm.
to use as ways to bring these concepts into classes without asking teachers to take on yet another aspect of the curriculum. So they're packaged in a Google Doc with reflection questions.
I love that. Bell ringers are a great time to introduce this. And I love that that's a regular classroom routine because this is not a one and done kind of lesson. This really needs to be infused all throughout the school year.
Absolutely.
What's the most important takeaway that you want folks to remember about everything that we've talked about today in terms of information literacy?
One of the things that's really struck me as I've gotten to speak with more educators is how important understanding misinformation is to our daily lives, and yet how absent it is from our standards.
Mm.
If you can, in any way, bring in various forms of misinformation into your classrooms so that students can start to think about it in a way that helps them recognize it in the real world, it will help them understand the subject areas better as well. But when you do so, try to do so in as humorous, as lighthearted, as non-triggering as possible. If you start with triggering forms of misinformation, then students will just shut off and they won't hear you. But make it fun. When I introduce conspiracy theories, I use birds aren't real because,
Yeah. Right. I've heard that
right?
one.
So, yeah, you introduce that conspiracy and teach students how conspiracy theories work. I don't have to bring in the FDA is hiding a natural cure for cancer or all the world scientists are conspiring about climate change. Birds aren't real. We're all laughing. We're all having a good time, but you can learn that way when you're not triggered.